Hello, my name is Spencer Walsh. I am the Chief Prosecutor for the Cache County Attorney's Office in Logan, Utah. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. I'm going to be presenting on an important case that I've handled, and it's going to focus on a case study for a serial rapist named Anthony Murphy. I'm just going to be covering the investigation and prosecution and what goes into a successful prosecution in these types of cases. So first off, did you know that most rapists are serial offenders? Many are. It is science, and if Ron Burgundy says so, then it has to be true, right? So recently I read some research from David Lisak, who came to present in Utah a couple of years ago. And he and others have studied this true principle, which is that those who commit sexual assault are many times serial offenders. For instance, in this study that was published in 2002, in Violence and Victims, pooling data from 4 samples in which 1,882 men were assessed for acts of interpersonal violence, we report on 120 men whose self-reported acts met legal definitions of rape or attempted rape, but who were never prosecuted by criminal justice authorities. A majority of those undetected rapists were repeat rapists, and a majority also committed other acts of interpersonal violence. The repeat rapists averaged 5.8 rapes each. So, I mean, that may be shocking to some. For those who are involved in, law enforcement or victim advocacy in some form, I don't know if that's going to be too shocking. It makes some sense. Rape is one of the more underreported crimes in our society, and those who rape often get away with it and continue to reoffend, sadly. So this Lisak article is not the others. They cite to their findings mirroring those of studies on incarcerated sex offenders in a 1991 study by Abel and others. And this all indicates that there are high rates of both repeat rape and multiple types of offending. So I'm not going to get into any more technical aspects of studies. In my experience as a prosecutor of about 10 years now, handling these types of cases, it's been my experience that those who sexually assault typically have more than one victim, although we don't always know about those. So let's talk a little bit about Anthony Murphy and how I came to file charges against him and what we found out about him and how we were able to successfully prosecute him. So this is Anthony Murphy, a few snapshots over the years. Couple of decades being involved in law enforcement and the criminal justice system, and essentially he got away with raping women and teen girls for about 2 decades with really not many consequences. A few minor convictions, some acquittals, charges not being filed, etc. He just seemed to keep getting away with it. So how were we able to finally hold him accountable in a sexual assault case where society can be protected from him, where he can be locked up? That's what I want to be discussing in this presentation. What I found, and what I think Hillary's so amazed by there, is some case law in Utah called the Doctrine of Chances. This is a principle in case law that was formally adopted by the Utah Supreme Court in 2012 in a case called State versus Verde. And in this case, the Utah Supreme Court gave some guidance. And I'm not going to get into all of the case law and the different nuances of it. I'm going to be a little bit brief here and just kind of summarize what the Doctrine of Chances is. Essentially, it is a logical relevance theory. It is a principle that when one person claims rape, the unusual and abnormal element of lying by the complaining witness may be present. But when you have two or more people telling similar stories, the chances are reduced that both are lying, or that one is telling the truth and the other is coincidentally telling a similar false story. So essentially, what the Supreme Court in Verde said is that if you can determine that multiple accusers have made their accusations against a suspect independent of one another, that's very important. You got to show that they didn't collude together, that they didn't tag team and get their story straight or anything like that. But if you can show that these accusers have independently made their accusations and that the accusations are similar in nature, then, I mean, it just seems common sense. It is logical that you could think through that as the fact finder, as a member of the jury, or as a judge, and you could ask yourself, is the accused here telling the truth when they say that they've been falsely accused and that the alleged victim is lying? Or, how likely is that? What are the odds that multiple women would falsely accuse someone of the same thing and they don't even know each other? So the judge, the jury can use that in credibility determinations, and they could reach the conclusion, okay, these women, they don't know each other. They're both sharing a strikingly similar story. We believe that that the alleged victim, that the victim here, is being truthful, and that would be using a logical relevance thought process that is certainly permissible now in Utah and many other states. It depends on the state, but here in Utah, we can do that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit now about the facts in the case that I charged. It was actually one of the first cases that I filed charges on when I moved to Logan, Utah, to work at the Cache County Attorney's Office as a special victims prosecutor. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of the background of the facts of this case. Anthony Murphy was in a domestic violence relationship with the victim in this case, or the survivor, I guess we should say. The survivor in this case, her name is, well, I'm not going to tell you her name, but her initials are TW. And I still keep in contact with her. She really is an amazing person. As you'll see, the patience, the fortitude, the strength, the courage that she exhibited over years of a prosecution are really admirable. And I'm happy to report that she is doing very well. She manages a restaurant in the Salt Lake City area. She has since been remarried and is in a good relationship. And I touch base with her from time to time. So she's given me permission to share her story with you, in hopes that whether you're in victim advocacy or law enforcement or in treatment, a treatment provider of some sort, that we can do a better job as a society in supporting those who are victims of sexual assault and in bringing them justice and protecting society from those who would be serial offenders. So, September 2008, Anthony, or Tony as he goes by, got married to TW. They really had a pretty good courtship. There was not a lot of problems. He seemed very kind. He seemed very charismatic. Really, there was only one incident that, looking back, TW thought, okay, that was a red flag that I should have picked up on. The red flag was they were at a bar in Idaho. The bartender was starting to flirt with or hit on TW, and Tony got really jealous. He took her outside and pushed her up against a wall at this bar, and he said, just because you don't have a ring on right now doesn't mean you're not mine. And he seemed very angry about things. And then she walked from the bar somewhere else. She walked to where they were staying. And so, looking back, she can see that was him showing some power and control and trying to control her, which is a hallmark of a DV relationship. But they were in love. She thought, well, maybe he cares this much about me, etc. Other than that, things were going great in their relationship. They got married. As I mentioned, in September, on the second day of their honeymoon, the physical abuse started. He got really intoxicated, and when she went to help him up, he had fallen down. He got aggressive with her, telling her that he didn't need her help, and he got angry and physically laid his hands on her. And this, unfortunately, became common in their marriage. Physical and sexual abuse took place during their marriage. He was controlling over the family finances. She had to walk on eggshells, and when he traveled for business, she kind of dreaded him coming home. They went through the classic domestic violence cycle where you have the honeymoon stage, and then you have this tension building stage, and then you have violence in the marriage, and the cycle continued. And that was what was going on in their relationship. Now, a few months into their marriage, in January, TW was admitted into the behavioral health unit of a hospital in Bountiful. She was actually transported from Logan down to Bountiful, and she was having suicidal ideations. And in the paperwork at the behavioral health unit, it shows that she was reporting depression, alcohol abuse, suicidal thoughts, and she reported that there was physical and sexual abuse in the marriage, and that's why she was so distraught and depressed, and that's why she was turning to alcohol for, I guess, a coping mechanism. So in January, she gets admitted into the behavioral health unit. She was there for a time, and then she was released. In February, the police start getting called out. February 1st, there was an anonymous tip to check on her. They show up to the house. She's crying. She's not been injured or anything like that. They've both been drinking. They've been in a verbal argument. Not much happens there that the police see. In February, later on that month of 28th, Tony calls 911, says that TW has hit him. Then he recants, and the police come to check, and they find her, and she's still in bed, pretending to be asleep, fully dressed. The police didn't really know exactly what was going on. Obviously, it was a domestic argument going on, and TW, was afraid to report to law enforcement the physical abuse that was going on. In April, Tony called 911 again. This time he was intoxicated at a 7-Eleven, saying that she had tried to tie him up. Anyway, there was frequent police interaction in this relationship. And that brings us to the date of the crime that took place, a very serious crime. And I'm going to tell you the facts about what was going on that day that led to this. So May 31st, 2009, Tony gets a text from another woman, and TW got upset with that. This had been a point of contention in their marriage. She had kind of forbid him from having communication with this other woman, and even though the text message that was sent wasn't really sexual or flirtatious in nature, it had to do with another matter, she still felt disrespected by that. So they got in a verbal argument. She goes to bed, and then Tony convinced her to come outside and to dance with her. A little bit more information. When they were fighting over the text message, at some point Tony got a phone call from his boss, and she was still arguing and kind of yelling at him, and that embarrassed him. So my thought on this is that the motive for this crime that I'm going to tell you took place, I'm going to give you some more information about. I believe that the motive for the crime was the fact that she was yelling at him when he was on the phone with his boss, and he felt like, I need to show this woman that I'm in charge here, and that's unacceptable for her to yell at me, and I'm going to really show her. And you'll see what he did. So at some point later that night, she had gone to bed. He convinces her to come back outside and dance in the backyard. This was something that they often did. They listened to music and dance. So that wasn't too unusual. So she thought that things had calmed down. They were moving past their argument. She goes outside. They're dancing. Well, Tony started to spin her around really, really hard and fast, and he threw her down onto the ground. And then he proceeded to rip her clothes off, her body, her bra, her pants, her shorts, her shirt. He just ripped them all off, and she immediately knew that she was in serious trouble. So she screamed. She runs for the house, trying to get in through the back door. She's stark naked, and it is just dark at that time. It has just gotten dark at dusk time. No neighbors hear anything. He catches up to her and pushes her down the stairs as she enters the house. He's a lot bigger than her. And she really had no chance of getting away. In my closing argument to the jury, I compared it to a lion chasing its prey. And that's exactly what he did. He caught up with her. He dragged her into the family room. He was naked. She doesn't recall how exactly that happened. And that was something that defense attorneys tried to attack her for. But as I'll talk about a little bit more, the more we start to understand about trauma and how that affects the brain, the more we realize that it is not uncommon for victims or people who have gone through a traumatic event to get a timeline jumbled up or to be missing bits and pieces of what took place in a traumatic incident. So she doesn't remember how he got naked, but she does remember him straddling her with his knees on her chest. He started to hit her in the face with his erect penis. He started to say things like, "You'll remember me, bitch. Suck it, bitch." The reason why I have "You'll remember me, bitch" in red there is that was a specific phrase that Tony chose to say in an effort to psychologically terrorize her, because when TW was a young girl, she had been a victim of child sex abuse. And one thing that her abuser had told her was, "You'll remember me," and she had disclosed that to Tony in confidence in the course of their marriage, and now he was using that phrase to strike terror into TW's heart. A very sickening thing that he did there. So he starts to try to humiliate her and to become sexually aggressive. He forces his penis into her mouth. And at trial, she says, "I always felt like I was so strong, but it's quite a thing to realize the strength that you don't have." And there was nothing she could do to resist his unwanted sexual assault. He proceeded to twist her nipples, which caused her pain. She tried to crawl away into the hallway, and he caught her. She was begging for her life. She said, "For the sake of my children and grandchildren, please don't kill me." And he says, "I'll kill you, bitch." So this is a picture here that shows the stairway that she was pushed down into, and just a short distance from that landing spot is where he drug her into this room, a family room, and then she crawls out of the family room into the area where there's this red X, and there is a kind of a space heater on the wall there. And so he pushed her up against the wall, and he strangled her with his right hand. It was a manual strangulation. And then he used his left arm and hand to get support on the wall to maintain his balance. As he was strangling her, TW could not breathe. She felt like she was drowning, is what she described at trial. She said that everything was getting darker and darker, and her last thoughts were for her children and grandchildren and wanting to live. When she woke up, she realized that she had urinated when she was passed out. And as we'll talk about maybe a little bit later, that is a sign of a very serious strangulation. Anytime that there's defecation or urination in a strangulation, it's safe to say that that victim is on death's doorstep, which was the case here. When she regained consciousness, Tony took her upstairs to the bathroom. He put her in a bath of cold water, tells her to clean herself up. I don't know. Was that more just kind of harassment, humiliation, aggressiveness? Was he having her clean up evidence? What was his mind frame there? It's hard to say. The next thing that happened is that he took her into the master bedroom, and she, for the life of her, cannot remember anything that happened in the bedroom. What we do know is that we later found blood spatter, maybe not even like spatter. It was more like there was blood marks, probably came from a cut on her mouth, and it was all over the bedding up there. So something happened in the bedroom. She can't remember. And that was something, once again, that defense counsel really laid into her on the witness stand, saying, you don't remember what happened in there. You're making this up. You're a liar. But we were able to show through expert testimony that, once again, very common for victims in a traumatic event such as a strangulation, sexual assault, kidnapping, that they are going to be missing bits and pieces of their memory because of the trauma involved. So that's what happened to her. We don't know what happened in that bedroom. She does next remember being thrown down the stairs again, and he drags her into a back bedroom. He pinned her down, and he once again forced his penis into her mouth. All of his weight was on top of her, and she couldn't breathe, and she lost consciousness again. When she regained consciousness, at some point, Tony, who had been consuming alcohol, heavily that day. They both had been drinking. He fell over drunk, and she was able to actually escape the house. She grabbed her robe. She was completely naked under a robe and the car keys, and she drives over to her boss's house. Tony and TW were friends with Tony's boss and the boss's wife. They were mutual friends. They hung out on weekends frequently. So this is where she thought to go. She bursts into their home without even knocking, and it's after midnight, and she was hysterical. She was crying. She had a red, puffy face, and she told them that Tony had beaten her. She never got into the sexual component of the abuse in front of the boss, but the boss's partner, TW, did disclose to her as a female friend. I think she felt more comfortable doing that, and so she disclosed that she had been sexually assaulted by Tony as well. Now, Tony's boss is an old friend of Tony's. They've been friends for years. He told her not to call the police. He said, "We're going to handle things. We're going to take care of this." And she slept there that night at the boss's home. And she was very worried about her job. She had a good job. She worked at Hobby Lobby, and she didn't want to lose it. So she was so worried about losing her job that, even though it may sound counterintuitive to some, early the next morning, she had Tony's boss take her back to the house where Tony was at so she could get ready for work. Now, she didn't go into the house or anything like that until the boss first checked things out. And when he went in, he saw Tony passed out drunk on the couch. So the boss stood guard while TW went in, collected her things so she could get ready for work, got dressed, and then he took her to Hobby Lobby. Now, when she first walks in the door for work that morning, her coworker thinks she's been in a car wreck. She didn't look like herself. He described it at trial as her face being grotesquely swollen and that she did not look like herself. TW later described the pain in her throat as the worst strep throat you can imagine. She had difficulty swallowing and eating, which is consistent with a strangulation. Not all survivors who are strangled have that symptom, but many do. So that next morning, it's now June 1st, she's at work, and TW was probably never going to call the police, but her coworkers did. They had seen some signs of an abusive relationship previously when TW was working there, and they were concerned for her safety. They called the police, and a patrol officer comes over and takes an initial report. He observed red marks on her neck, and he took this blurry photo here. Photos weren't great at Hobby Lobby that day. He interviewed her about what happened, and she did not disclose the sexual component of the assault. The coworker was in the same room at the time, though, I would note. And once again, oftentimes victims in domestic violence relationships are embarrassed by the fact that their husband would do this to them. It's embarrassing that people at work would know about that. And so she really didn't fully disclose, other than saying that she got hit and choked by her husband. So the patrol officers took some photos. They tried to record 6 voicemails that the defendant had left on her phone. They were kind of rambling, drunken statements where he's kind of slurring his speech and telling her that she needs to get back there. And unfortunately, the police had recorded those voicemails with a lot of background noise. I think there were some nice Hobby Lobby music in the background, and there were some people talking, and it really made it so those voicemails were not effective at trial. We played those for the jury. You could pick up a few words here and there, but it really wasn't effective. So law enforcement, just a lesson learned from this aspect of the case would be to be careful to record things without the background noise, and to preserve evidence as best as you can. No investigation is perfect, though. We get that. The next day, she goes and sees her doctor. She tells her doctor that she was beaten by her husband, pushed down the stairs, held up against a wall by her throat. Once again, though, she does not disclose any part of the sexual assault, the forced oral sex, the twisting of the nipples, etc. That was not brought up. She was too embarrassed to talk about it. The doctor did note bruises and injuries to her face, jaw, upper chest, thigh, legs, and her ribs as well. The next day, June 3rd, TW was interviewed by a detective at the police department, and the detective made her feel safe and comfortable. So she was able to open up about the sexual component of the assault. She told me that exact thing. She said, I was not going to tell anyone about that, but the detective made me feel so safe and comfortable in the interview that I was able to disclose and open up about what had happened. I would note that this interview took place after 2 sleep cycles, which is what the research tells us is best to do for the full interview after someone's gone through a trauma like this. Because at that point, the memory perhaps has come together a little bit better, and it's not as fragmented. Follow-up photos were taken by the police. Those are all great things. Now, there was no SANE exam that took place. That's something that should have been done. I'm sure that probably the officer's thinking, you know what, that was 3 days ago. She showered. What would be the point of the SANE exam? But what would have been helpful is you would have had a trained nurse be able to examine her body as opposed to just her general physician. And they have special training to note injuries specifically and photograph those injuries. So we did lose some evidence. Photographs, notations could have given us additional information to show that the strangulation took place and the different injuries on TW's body. So that's one thing. Looking back now, once again, I'm not criticizing law enforcement, but looking back, the SANE exam should have been done. The crime scene also was not processed until a couple days later. That did cause us some problems. And then there was some poor handling of evidence at the crime scene that we'll talk about. This is TW. She's given me permission to use these photos. I am trying to protect her identity, though. But so that's why I have her eyes blurred out here. But you can see injuries to her face. Near the right side of her mouth, there's a large bruise. There's redness and swelling on her chin, nose, and then there's bruising and some swelling underneath her left eye there. Here are some bruises near the clavicle area on her body, and those are consistent with when he was pinning her down on the ground and he had his knees up on her before he committed his forcible oral sex on her. And that bruising, our expert testified, is consistent with her account. Moving back one slide again, our expert also testified that the bruising near her mouth would be consistent with pressure being put on her mouth by a hand in an effort to open up a mouth to insert the penis. That bruising could be consistent with her account of that. And she was also hit in the face, and that bruising on her face would be consistent with her account as well. We had some very helpful expert testimony by Beth Weekly with Wasatch Forensic Nurses. So Nurse Weekly helped educate our jury about some very important parts in this case. She helped explain how strangulation is used in DV relationships to establish power and control. The abuser literally has the victim's life in their hands. She noted that strangulation is the 4th most common cause of homicide. 12% of sexual assault victims are strangled in Salt Lake City, per new research. That was as of, I want to say, 2016. And then surprisingly for many, less than 50% of strangulation victims have any visible injury whatsoever. Memory loss is an indicator of hypoxic brain injury. So not only did TW go through a traumatic incident, which would be an explanation as to why she had portions of her memory that were blank, but also it makes sense that where oxygen was being deprived to her brain, there was memory loss there. It's an indicator of this hypoxic brain injury. All of that was information that we explained to the jury carefully so that they could understand strangulation, how it works, the lethality of it, and the injuries involved. Here's another picture of TW's body. Those are some defensive wounds, probably on her right arm. This is her left thigh, upper thigh, and you can see 3, I believe they're fingertip bruises. They're circular bruises that are consistent with being grabbed by fingers. There's an injury on her toe. These were follow-up injuries taken at the police department. Now, this particular police department did not have a female officer at the time, so I think for some of these more sensitive photos, they had their secretary go in and take those photos. Depending on the police department size or different resources available, this was a rural community, and they did the very best they could do. Once again, getting back to the lack of a SANE exam, had there been a formal SANE exam done, they could have taken photos. I'm sure there was injuries under her clothes that were not photographed or noted and preserved, just because there was only male officers there and we didn't have a professional noting the injuries there. All right, June 5th, so this is 5 days after the crime. The police finally do the walkthrough of the home. They photograph the crime scene. They find a ripped shirt in the laundry room that TW had been wearing. They find grass-stained shorts that she had been wearing. They find her bra. It had a black smudge on it. It was still clasped. I believe that the black smudge was likely mascara. They find blood-stained bedding that was in the dryer. It had been washed and laundered. It was in the dryer. They found a carpet stain, a green stain on the carpet. They also found green cleaner in the house and a seal on top of the wall heater near where she was strangled. They also found a handprint in the dust on the wall. Here's a picture of the blood-stained bedding. There's a picture of some grass stains on some jean shorts, and there's a picture of a ripped shirt worn by the survivor in this case. Now, all of these items were found in the laundry room. There were some inexperienced officers who failed to photograph the evidence where they found it in the laundry room. Then they had TW walk through the events and kind of do a walkthrough to recreate the crime scene, and they dropped the shirt there and took that photograph. That was later argued by defense counsel that they were trying to plant evidence, but they clearly noted in their report that they found these items in the laundry room, but it was poor handling of the evidence. They should have photographed the clothing items where they found them. They should have never taken them outside to drop them. They should have put a marker out there where her clothes were torn from her body, and then taken a photo with the marker to document that, but they never should have moved the evidence there. But once again, I'm friends with these officers. I work with them. I respect them. They did their best, but we can always learn from our mistakes. And so I'm just gonna touch on a few of those, but I'm not attempting to be overly critical of the police investigation here. Here's a picture of the green stain on the carpet. This is where TW had urinated herself during this serious strangulation. The defendant Tony tried to clean up the crime scene, and he used some green cleaner that they had bought the day before, and he didn't dilute it very much, and it left a green stain there. He also left this seal to the brand new bottle of green cleaner that they had purchased the day before, and he left that on the space heater there. And then in the early morning hours of June 1st, 2009, Tony called 911 when he realized, after he had keeled over being drunk, and then he realized that she had gotten away. He didn't know where she had gone to. He left several voicemails, couldn't find her. And so then he called law enforcement, and here is a 911 phone call that he made.
911, what's the address of the emergency?
Hey, lady, Anthony Murphy here. I need to report my wife is missing at this point.
Okay, what address is she missing from?
325 South Main Street, Smithfield, Utah.
How long has she been gone?
I'd say about an hour now.
How old is she?
She is 46 years old.
What's her name? Say where she was going?
No, she just jumped in the car and took off.
Okay, have you guys been arguing?
Not really arguing, but yes, she is upset at me. And she does have a history of, attempting to commit suicide and stuff, and I'm just concerned about her at this point.
Okay. Now, does she have a history of attempting or just threatening suicide?
Well, actually attempting.
Okay.
And both.
Did she have any weapons or anything with her tonight?
No.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Anthony, I'm going to send an officer over to your house to chat with you, okay?
Okay, that'd be great.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay, so that was Tony calling 911, and as you can see, immediately he is doing some damage control. He's trying to attack her credibility in case she goes to the police and says that, he's worried about her, that she's been suicidal in the past. He denies that they've had a physical altercation. He says they've been arguing a little bit, but he denies that any weapons were involved, things like that. So when the officers go over there, They noticed that Tony had red bloodshot eyes, slurred speech, poor balance. He actually threatened to fight the police if they were thinking of citing him with intoxication. They never even brought up the fact that they were going to cite him with anything. They just went and touched base with him about his missing wife. And he got a little bit aggressive with them in that way. So that was all evidence that the jury heard about. And here's what Tony did after he sexually assaulted TW. He didn't show up for work the next day. He disappeared from the home. He drained their bank account. He retained an attorney who was a friend of his boss's. He went down to the attorney's office and took photographs of his injuries, quote unquote. And then he hired a private investigator who found a bloody knife. We're going to talk about all of those things. So here's some photos taken in his attorney's office in Salt Lake. You can see some red scratch marks on his left shoulder area, chest, shoulder area. That's a close-up. And he never spoke with the police. He exercised his right to an attorney, and he refused to speak to law enforcement. But at trial, he came up with quite a little story. He said that he and his wife were arguing outside at their table, at their patio table. He said that at the time they were arguing, he said some mean things to her. She had been jealous over this text message, and he had said some stuff like, maybe I should just cheat on you if you're going to always accuse me of cheating, or something to that effect. And he said that he was a little bit rude, and that when he said some hurtful things, she had been cleaning up the table and had a paring knife in her hand, and that she became so enraged that she jumped up onto him. He was sitting on a chair, and she started to repeatedly punch him while holding the knife in her hand, leaving these kind of superficial wounds. As you'll note, though, they're all very in close proximity, and they're very superficial lacerations or scratches, I guess you'd probably call them, and they're almost overlapping one another. So we had an expert look at that, Dr. Todd Gray from the Utah Medical Examiner's Office. He's since retired, but he came in and he testified about those injuries, and he testified that it was unlikely that they were caused by TW doing this in the manner that the defendant had described, and that these injuries were consistent with if you took the back end of this knife and just kind of dragged it over the surface of the skin repeatedly. I mean, what I argued to the jury was that wouldn't make sense. If you have some enraged woman who is repeatedly taking swings at you, you would expect that the knife mark, the wound, would be a little bit more uneven, maybe some type of a puncture wound, or at least an uneven wound. And I mean, what are the odds that they could all be essentially overlapping one another? I mean, for that to happen, it's almost like you'd have to be sitting completely still and carefully make the same drag mark over the skin, 4 or 5 times there. So we didn't believe that was credible, neither did the jury. There was also some injuries on his back. I think those are actually legitimate injuries. I believe those are consistent with TW's fingernails scratching his back during the course of this sexual assault. Here is a picture of a shed in the backyard of the property that the defense attorney's private investigator would later find a bloody knife. This is the knife. It's a little paring knife, actually a really dull knife, and it was collected by the private investigator. It was sent to the crime lab, and it showed that it had Tony Murphy's blood on it. Now, The state sent evidence to the crime lab as well. They sent the mattress cover, or I guess it's the bedding you would call it, and there were indications of blood found on it, but no human proteins were detected, possibly due to sample quality, sample quantity, or non-human source. We believe that because he had laundered these, that it had compromised the quality of the DNA in the blood, and so the human proteins could not be detected. But clearly there was blood on there, and they didn't have any animals or other pets or anything like that in the house. No other explanation for the blood. We also sent the carpet and the carpet pad to the Utah State Crime Lab, and there were no indications of urine found on those. And we argued to the jury that's because he cleaned it up. He cleaned up the urine to hide his crime. We next sent the carpet and the carpet pad to Sorensen Forensics Laboratory. They did find an inconclusive DNA profile result from the carpet, and they found a mixture of DNA profiles on the carpet pad, but they were of poor quality and could not be definitive. The case dragged on for years. The defendant's boss and the boss's wife sided with Tony. They came to his aid. They testified for him at the preliminary hearing. They tried to throw TW under the bus and to attack her credibility in front of the court. The private investigator tried to dig up dirt on TW. They tried to get in evidence of things in her past, about past abuse that she experienced. And they tried all sorts of things. The boss bailed Tony out of jail, so he was out on bail. At one court hearing, he admitted to ponying up $120,000 for Tony's defense. And so for years, we litigated various issues. We successfully kept out TW's sexual abuse as a child out of the trial. Totally irrelevant and inappropriate to bring anything like that up under Rule 412. We also kept details about her relationship with an ex-husband out of the trial. They were not relevant under Rules 401, 402, and 403. And then the defendant had also requested access to TW's mental health records. Remember, she had suicidal ideations, and she had gone to the behavioral health unit. So eventually the judge granted the defendant's request, and he conducted an in-camera or in-chambers review of those records. Then he redacted anything that was not necessary to disclose, and then he disclosed the rest to defense counsel as well as the state. Which we actually thought was not necessarily bad for us, because there was details in those records that showed that, yeah, she was suicidal, she was depressed, she was using marijuana, she was using alcohol. She was doing all that because she was in an abusive relationship where she was being physically and sexually assaulted. There was also an issue with a jailhouse informant that early on I was considering using. And he was one of the nicest bank robbers you'll ever meet. He's in federal prison, and we got him up here to testify at some pretrial hearings because Tony had disclosed some of the details of the crime to him, made some admissions. Ultimately, we ended up not using him because we were able to present evidence at this trial of other victims, other survivors of this defendant. And we felt confident that we did not need to use Mr. Bank Robber Jailhouse Informant. And then finally, one reason that there was years of litigation is that we did 404B motion to try to get in evidence of his other bad acts. We were denied initially. At that time, we knew about his ex-wife accusing him of rape in 1997. And the judge denied that. He said that it wasn't close enough in time, etc. And so the case was dragging on. Well, while he was out on bail, actually about a week and a half before his scheduled trial in November of 2014, I believe, he was arrested by the West Valley City Police Department for attacking a young woman in a hotel room and strangling her. And I'm going to give you some details about that shortly. So once that came out, the trial got delayed, and the judge granted, eventually, a motion for me to allow other bad acts, other things that the defendant had done in his life into evidence at trial. And I did some additional investigation. I made contact with prosecutors in Kentucky, and we were able to track down records from the archives of the Kentucky State Police Department. And you're going to hear about various victims that the defendant had that we were not aware of initially. So I'm going to go through those. The first victim that the defendant had, this was in 1997, and he was married to this individual. I'm going to call her G.O. G.O. got a domestic violence injunction, essentially like a protective order against him. He was ordered to complete domestic violence counseling, alcohol counseling, and she was given primary custody of the children. That was in May of 97. Now in June of 97, Tony showed up early to pick up the kids for his visitation, but he showed up way early. He was drunk and his clothes were soaking wet. Gio let him into the house. He grabbed her by the arm and he dragged her down the hall to a bedroom where he vaginally and anally raped her, and he forced oral sex on her. During the course of the sexual assault, he did put his hand over her mouth and nose so she could not breathe. During the assault, he had a butcher knife with him, and he said he was going to try to make her so mad that she would kill him, and he put the knife in her hand. Really what he was doing is he was exercising power and control, brandishing the weapon to put her in fear. Later on, she was able to escape when he fell asleep drunk on a couch. And she ran to a neighbor's house and called 911. I'll just play a short clip. It's not the best quality, but we got this from the state of Florida years later. And here's just a short clip of it.
Jacksonville Beach 911. What's going on, ma'am? My ex-husband is up in the house this morning. I ran to the neighbor's house, but he's crazy. He's got a knife. He's got a knife? Yeah. He's got a knife. What's he look like? 6 foot. He's so crazy. I'm not sure. He's got just a bit of blood on right now. Is everybody in the house? He's in the house with my daughter. He's in the house with your daughter? How's your daughter? She's 6. Okay, ma'am. What's he wearing? Do you remember? Did you get a black t-shirt? Okay, just stay on the line. I want you to calm down, okay? Okay, just wear a pair of black pants, no shirt, no. Dark hair, dark mustache.
Okay, I apologize if you couldn't hear that clearly, but she was essentially telling the dispatcher that her husband had attacked her. He had a knife, and she was hysterical. So when the police show up to the house, they find Tony asleep on the couch. He denies raping Gio. He says he was out drinking at a bar the night before. He got back to his place at 2:30 a.m. He woke up with a hangover at exactly 6:18 a.m. and then he went over to Gio's residence at 6:47 a.m. The police found his wet clothes. They found a sanitary pad in the bedroom, which was consistent with what Gio said happened, that he removed the pad during the course of the sexual assault. They did find a butcher knife in the sink. They took Gio to the hospital for a SANE exam, and they found no fingerprints on the knife, and they did not find any semen on a swab that was taken from a bed sheet. The defendant was arrested for the sexual assault, but charges were not filed at that time. because they didn't have DNA evidence. June 24th, 1997, Gio got a protective order, and the protective order said that Tony could not go in or near her residence or place of employment. He was to have no contact with her. She was so terrified of Tony that she slept with a loaded pistol underneath her pillow every night. Now, on August 8th, 1997, when she was asleep in bed with her 6-year-old daughter, Tony broke into the house. He pried open the door with the screwdriver, and he pinned Gio down in her bed. Once again, the 6-year-old daughter was in bed at the time with mom. He pins Gio down and says he's taking the children, and if she follows them, he's going to kill her. Tony starts to pull Gio out of bed. She reaches for her pistol, and she shoots Tony 4 times in the chest. She runs out of the house and calls 911. She runs out of the house with her daughter. So if you learn nothing else from this presentation, I hope you learn to use better ammunition, because the ammo she had wasn't very effective. He lived. Police find Tony's van 2 blocks away. And there's a little diagram of the suspect's vehicle and the victim's residence. Keep in mind, there was a protective order in place. He parks his van 2 blocks away. Then he pries open and breaks and enters into the house. And there's a pry mark on the door that he gained entry through. Here is a picture of the bed where Tony was found, bleeding out in the bed. And emergency services were able to transport him to the hospital, and doctors were able to save his life. Police did find, though, a razor blade knife that was retractable. They found that in his back right pocket when he was bleeding in the bed. And Sergeant Leone says, for officer safety, I extracted both of these items from the subject's pocket and dropped them on the floor by the bed. The screwdriver is what he was able to pry open the door with to gain access. Here's a picture of the gunshot wounds to the defendant. So 3 of the chest. Looks like she got him once in the leg. Now, at this point, the prosecutors go back and they file 3 counts of sexual assault with a deadly weapon and the burglary charges. The sexual assault charges were dismissed as part of a plea deal, and the defendant ended up pleading no contest to a burglary and got 1 year in jail. The survivor in this case, Gio, who I have spoken with frequently, she's testified at some hearings. She was just absolutely livid about the plea deal that was given. So she wrote to the governor of the state of Florida to share her concerns with how the prosecution was handled. The prosecutor wrote a CYA letter in response. He says there was no physical evidence to support her testimony. He says that the most significant concern was that her demeanor and tone made her a non-credible witness. Then he gets into the gunshot residue and says that law enforcement concluded that the gun used by Murphy, used to shoot Murphy, propelled the residue for a distance of 2 feet, yet there was no residue found on the defendant's clothes. And the victim said she fired when the defendant was laying on top of her, like at point blank range. So he says that, you know what, she couldn't be telling the truth. Which, I find ridiculous. Please, whether it's 2 feet, 2 inches away when you shoot, or right on top of you when you're in a traumatic situation, I'm sure it felt like he was right on top of her. And to be able to somehow divine someone's credibility based on their tone and demeanor, that's ridiculous as well. So this was really just a cover your own ass sort of a letter here to save face with the governor. So unfortunately, he did a year in jail for what he did to his ex-wife. Then in September of 2000, the defendant, he's already out of jail, right? Well, by this time, he's got a girlfriend in Kentucky, and his girlfriend has an 18-year-old daughter. Well, early one morning, he goes into the house. LM is the 18-year-old daughter. She's asleep in her bed. And Tony used to date her mom. They really weren't together anymore, but he knew that she had this daughter. So she woke up early in the morning, and Tony is standing in her room saying her name. She tried to scream for her mother, but he put his hand over her mouth, and he held her down by the throat with her other hand. And he says, "If you don't shut up, I'll kill you." He pushed her down on the bed, and that caused a cut on the inside of her mouth. He ripped her clothes off, strangled her, and raped her. And before he leaves, he tells her not to tell anyone. As he's leaving the house that morning, LM's 7-year-old little sister sees him, and Tony notices that, and he threatens the 7-year-old. He says that he's going to kill her if she tells her mother. The 7-year-old was able to later give a full, detailed description of exactly what Tony was wearing. And that's exactly what he was wearing when law enforcement made contact with him later that day. Tony's brother told the police that he saw Tony leaving this residence that morning, and that LM had come downstairs crying and said that Tony had mashed her mouth up. LM was transported to the hospital for a SANE exam because she did tell her mom, and the nurses were able to observe an abrasion and swelling on her upper lip, blood in her hair. Her lip was bleeding. She had scratches on her neck. She had bilateral petechiae on both sides of her neck, and she had bruises on her wrists. There was no DNA evidence that was able to be found. He was interviewed by the police. Tony was. The first interview, he says, never had any sexual contact with LM. That morning, we just talked, but we have been sexually active previously, he says. During the second interview, his story now changes, and he says that he drank 6 beers before going over there. And then he says, actually, there was some sexual touching, but no intercourse, and it was consensual sexual touching. And he says that when he left, he saw the 7-year-old sister, but he never spoke to her, and he has no idea how LM's mouth was injured. So that's the conflicting stories that Tony gives to the police. Tony's sister is interviewed by the police, and she says he's not been himself lately, and he had been admitted to the BHU the week prior feeling suicidal, and that he had been, it says here, the problems on admission were a depressed mood, anger, rage issues, safety issues, and his issues for outpatient treatment were anger control. So I did find it ironic that they spent a lot of the trial laying into the survivor, TW in our case, about how she was supposedly crazy because she had to go to the behavioral health unit, when Mr. Murphy himself did the same thing. So I found it a little bit disingenuous. So Tony was arrested on suspicion of first-degree rape for what he had, for what LM said happened. Charges were filed. There was a grand jury, and I can't explain how this happened, but the grand jury, which is in Utah, we typically have preliminary hearings where the judge determines whether there's probable cause, which is a very low standard. It's, is there a reasonable belief that a crime was committed and this defendant committed the crime? And this grand jury heard the evidence, and they no true billed it, meaning they didn't find there was probable cause that Tony had sexually assaulted LM. I cannot explain it, why that would have happened, but that's what the grand jury, I don't know, maybe they were doing this back there. Just joking. I love all the people in Kentucky. So May 23rd, 2001. Now that Tony has, so far he's done a year in jail, for raping and then breaking and enter into his wife's place in Florida in 97, and he gets away with the one in 2000. Now we're in 2001, May 23rd. Tony goes drinking with AR's dad. This is AR here, pictured. This is when she was just 15 years old. The defendant, or I guess Tony, returned home with the dad. They'd been drinking, and AR is at home. Tony tries to dance with this 15-year-old, which is pretty weird. She didn't want to dance with him, and then he accidentally walked in on her when she was in the bathroom. So she had a bad vibe from this guy. So that night when she went to bed, she actually was with her boyfriend at the time, and they nailed the door shut to her room. Kind of weird, I know, but without getting into like all the details, needless to say, they nailed the door shut because they were so worried about this guy. I would later find out that one of the reasons is that she had heard that he had sexually assaulted a relative of hers in town named, I won't tell your name, but I never even knew about that. I heard about that when she traveled to Utah, and as we were prepping for trial, like the day before her testimony, she mentioned that to me. So kind of goes back to the point that many of these rapists are serial offenders. All right, so Tony puts, so they nailed the door shut, and then it's 4 a.m., and the next thing she knows is she wakes up and Tony is on top of her in bed. He's putting his hand over her mouth, and she cannot breathe. She's so terrified, and he says if she screams, he is going to kill her. He starts to kiss her neck. He starts to sexually assault her by touching her breasts and her vagina as well. So he starts to fondle her. She's able to bite his hand and starts to scream for her dad. She yells, "Daddy." And then dad hears this and tries to get into the room and ends up kicking the door in. Tony had gained access not through that door, but from an outside door that had some furniture in front of it. But he had waited for when the boyfriend left to go to the bathroom that morning. The boyfriend had moved the furniture out of this other door. And when he went to the bathroom, Tony saw his opportunity, and he went in there to sexually assault her. So the dad breaks down the door. He sees with his own two eyes Tony on top of his daughter, and he pulls Tony off of the daughter. And then there's a big fight that happens. AR is able to break free and gets into the next room. But Tony's stronger than the dad, and so he's able to pursue AR into the next room, and he tackles her. And he tells her nothing happened in there. Once again, dad comes in and frees up the daughter. She's able to run next door. Now, it's 4 a.m. She is banging on the neighbor's door. The neighbors come to the door, and Tony, she says, "Tony tried to rape me." And she's hysterically crying. They see a red handprint over her face. Tony follows over to the neighbor's house, and he actually gets into it with the father in that house, the neighbor. And the neighbor's telling him to get lost and stuff like that. AR is safely in his house, and he starts to assault this neighbor, Tony does, and he starts to choke him in the street. And this neighbor can't breathe, and his wife has to come up with a baseball bat, and he threatens to knock his effing head off to China if he doesn't leave. And so she's a tough lady, and he doesn't mess with her. He leaves, he drives away, and is later arrested for burglary, sexual assault, and assault. There's a jury trial on November 27th in 2001. And Tony testified. He admits, yeah, I drank 8 or 9 beers, but I'd never sexually assaulted AR. I just went into her bedroom at 4 in the morning, even though this was the first time that I'd ever met this 15-year-old girl, and I wanted to give her a talking to and ask her about whether her boyfriend had been abusive to her in their relationship, because that makes so much sense. So the jury found Tony not guilty of burglary. They found him guilty of choking the neighbor, and they were hung. They could not reach a unanimous decision on the sexual assault charge, sadly. So he was convicted of a misdemeanor assault on the neighbor is all that happened to him. A couple years later, July 4th, 2003, AK was a friend of Tony's. They were not romantically involved, but she worked at a diner that he frequented, and they struck up a friendship. So on July 4th, 2003, Tony asked her to hang out, and she agreed to go, to leave behind some stuff happening on the 4th of July with her family. They went to a liquor store, and Tony bought some Jim Beam. He gave it to her, and she drank a lot of it. She passed out in the truck. And the next thing she knew was she was waking up. It was nighttime now. Her clothes had been removed, and she was inside this truck, and they were parked in a field in a secluded area near a river. She was crying, screaming, and begging for Tony to let her go. Tony says, "No, you've made a promise to give me oral sex." And she says no. And then he starts to smack her in the face with a red folder. And then he threatens to drown her. He knows that she's deathly afraid of water because when she was little, she saw her cousin drown. And Tony promises, "I'll make sure nobody ever sees you again unless you do this." He also grabbed her by the wrist and burnt her neck with a cigarette, both on her neck and her finger. She had cigarette burns. So he sexually assaults her by forcing oral sex. And then afterwards, he makes her sign a piece of paper saying that she had consented to the sex. Kind of a weird thing. She scribbled down something. It wasn't her name. And the note that Tony had, you can see up here, he starts to write the note but never really finishes it. I think he's drunk too, and it doesn't make any sense anyway. So then he proceeded to vaginally rape her. And he even attempted to anally rape her, but she was able to fight him off. Tony eventually took AK home when it was light and it was the next morning. AK lived with her mother at the time. When Tony had taken her home, she goes immediately in. She's crying. She wakes her mother up and says that Tony had threatened to drown her and that he had raped her. Tony comes into the house uninvited and says, no, this was consensual and I have the letter to prove it. And he shows AK's mom this paper. We actually had AK and her mom come testify here in Utah, and can't thank them enough for their assistance in this case. The mother tells Tony he needs to leave immediately, and she's calling the cops. So the cops investigate this. AK has a SANE exam. She's interviewed by the police. They observe bruises on her wrists and arms, burn marks on her neck and finger. The police locate this truck that was used during this crime. They find a red folder, just like AK had said. They find a Jim Beam liquor bottle. They found blood stains on the seat of the truck because she was on her period at the time. And they find a scribbled letter. There's a picture there. You can see some petechiae faintly on her neck. You can also see a cigarette burn mark. It's a circular burn mark near the right clavicle. This photograph shows some bruising on her arm And then it shows a circular burn mark on her middle finger, on her left hand. There were no charges filed against Tony. There was no DNA evidence, and the police never even found Tony to interview him. And the DA's office says there's insufficient evidence to charge him there in Kentucky. So he gets away with another one. This shows a little bit of some blood swabs taken and some evidence collected in the case. So that was in 2003. The crime in Utah happens in 2009. What happens in that 6-year window? I don't know. If I was a bet man, I'd say he'd probably strangled and raped other women, but none that I know about. October 28, 2013. Once again, this was right before our trial that we were set for on TW's case. Tony was out on bail. He had arranged to meet with MM in West Valley City. She was a prostitute. He met her on backpages.com, and he frequently met her for erotic massages. Now, MM, I really like her. She did a great job at trial, testifying. She was a young woman who was a heroin addict. She was very, very desperate for money to get her next fix of heroin. And so that led her to giving erotic massages on backpages.com. Sad story. So one of her clients is Tony Murphy, who's awaiting charges for strangling and sexually assaulting someone. She's got no idea that. Tony's been drinking alcohol. On this particular massage, they'd met frequently. On October 28th, he massaged her back and buttocks. She was wearing panties. Tony was in his boxers. MM then massaged Tony's penis, and he started to reach for her panties, and she said, "No, I'm not having sex with you," and pushes his hand away. She continues her massage, and Tony reaches again for her panties, and she says again, "No." He tries a third time, and when MM says no, Tony starts to get angry and says yes. She says no, and he says yes. So she tried to get away and back away from Tony. He grabs for her and reaches for her, and she falls backwards onto the floor, onto that hotel carpet that's not very soft. That's where she got this raspberry on her right shoulder, the back of her right shoulder. That's from hitting her back on the carpet there. Tony grabbed MM by the throat and started to straddle her. He put his thumbs in her mouth, and MM is starting to see stars as he's strangling her. Her vision starts to go black. She cannot breathe. She believes she's going to die. Tony stops, but he won't let her have her phone. He eventually stops his strangulation. There's a hotel occupant who calls the front desk downstairs, and it was a truck driver, and the truck driver said, "I just heard a blood-curdling scream, and then I heard a loud thump in the room above mine. You might want to go check that out. I'm concerned." So the front desk employee goes to that room. She can hear this commotion, and Tony answers the door in a towel, and he says, "Hey, everything's fine. Sorry, we'll keep it down." MM is totally naked at this point, other than she's wearing panties still, and she ends up running out of the hotel room, naked. She's bleeding on her back shoulder and on her foot. She's got red marks on her neck, and she flees the room. When he says everything's fine, she says no, it's not, and then he allows her to run out the front door because he kind of had to at that point. October 28th, the same night, the police respond. They take photos of MM's injuries. They interview Tony. He's got alcohol in his room. He says they were having an erotic massage. He tried to take her panties off. She said no. And then they talked on the bed. And then the next thing he knew, the hotel clerk was knocking on the door. He says there was no physical altercation and there would be no reason for her to have any injuries. But he does say she does bruise easily. So clearly his story made no sense. She's got injuries all over her body. There you can see red marks on her neck, and you can also see some on her chin. There is a friction injury on her left foot, the top of her left foot, from the altercation once it got onto the carpet as she's being strangled. Tony's got injuries on his hand too. They were actually from when she bit his fingers, when he had his fingers up in his mouth, up in her mouth during the strangulation. And he says, nah, they're from some construction work I was doing. And he's got a bleeding injury on his arm too, near his elbow. Once again, he's saying that was from a work injury from earlier in the day, yet it's bleeding. Doesn't make any sense. Then he provides a written statement, and it's just pretty unbelievable. He's basically saying, hey, we had an argument. Basically, I'll just read from his statement. For a couple of minutes, he was getting massaged. Then I asked if we were going to have sex. She yelled no, and we talked on the bed for a couple of minutes. Then a knock came at the door. She told me to answer it. When I did, the employee asked us to keep it down, and I said we would. And then she said, I gotta leave. And she ran out. So, that story doesn't make any sense based on the injuries. So, unfortunately, her case went to trial, or Tony's case went to trial with MM, and that actually got to trial before ours did in Logan. The jury came back and found him guilty of kidnapping and assault. They did not find him guilty of an attempted sexual assault or of the aggravated kidnapping that we had charged. And that really hurt the victim because there was some very good defense lawyering in that case, and they got the judge to hold that these charges merged, meaning that that he was only convicted in the end of a misdemeanor assault. So anyway, it was a really, really frustrating situation, and she had no interest, although she'd been interested initially on helping us out with our case. After her bad experience with that jury trial, she had it, and she didn't want to be subpoenaed. So she was ignoring me, and I did subpoena her to court. She got mad at me, but I just wanted to talk with her. And what she didn't know is that if she refused to come, the fact that she'd already testified in court, I could use her testimony, but I at least had to try to subpoena her. She didn't know that. She was mad at me, but we worked out our issues, and she was so happy once Tony got convicted because she felt like she finally had justice. And she's doing much better. She's into a career now, and she's dealing with her addiction. And so I can't thank all these women enough. They all helped so much to help us in this trial. So running out of time here, I'm going to quickly emphasize a few points. One thing that I found effective was to visually emphasize the similarities between these crimes of women from all over the country who didn't know each other. Very, very similar. Alcohol was involved, with the defendant drinking alcohol in most of these. The defendant forced a sexual assault on the victim. He used violence and sometimes threats to intimidate his victims, and he unlawfully detained them. One thing that was a calling card, essentially, was that he either would strangle or try to block the airway of these victims, like suffocate the victims. And he did that as a way to get them to comply with his sexual assault. So one thing I did is I pointed out all of these similarities so that the jury could understand that there's no way that he could be falsely accused by women who don't know him separately, independently, of strikingly similar sexual assaults. And it convinced the jury. They found that was extremely compelling information. Now, unfortunately, this took so long to get to trial. The crime happened in June of 2009. We didn't get to trial until April of 2016. The jury found the victim to be credible. They found that the defendant committed all of these crimes. They found him guilty of aggravated sexual assault, aggravated kidnapping, forcible sex abuse, and aggravated assault. And he's now doing 30 years to life in the Utah State Prison. He will be appealing his conviction, but we're confident and hopeful that our conviction will be upheld. So I already touched on this throughout this presentation, but I can't stress enough how important it is to present expert testimony on the neurobiology of trauma so that judges and juries can understand why a victim might not recall the entirety of the assault, why there could be a jumbled order in the events, the chronology might be off, portions of their memory might be missing, and that's normal. That's to be expected. Because during trauma, the brain goes into survival mode. It's in this hypervigilance mode, fight or flight mode. So it stops its normal activity in order to protect the victim. And that causes the victim to be focused on the threat and kind of have tunnel vision during the course of the trauma. Our expert likened this to a hiker being chased by a grizzly bear who's up in the mountains, and you come upon this grizzly bear and then you start to run for your life. And we wouldn't expect that hiker to remember the exact path they took to run to safety, what rocks or what trees they ran past and what it all looked like, everything that happened. No, but the hiker might remember the teeth, the sharp teeth, what they looked like. It might remember running as fast as they could and the feelings that they felt. But we wouldn't expect the hiker to remember every step of the way. Where did you get that scratch? How did you end up at this log cabin? What was the exact path that you took? Did this really happen? We wouldn't expect that. And I don't have time to talk about tonic immobility, but there's a fight, flight, or freeze mode that happens with victims. And this happens in the animal kingdom as well. And so the brain can go onto the autopilot mode where the victim really can't say anything or do anything. They freeze, so to speak. And you'll hear victims of sexual assault say that all the time. And that's something we need to educate juries on so that they can make correct decisions. Jurors want to do the right thing, and we need to give them the tools to do that. Briefly, we also explain to the jury the dynamics of DV relationships and how those work. A jury probably doesn't understand that they might not understand this wheel of power and control, and they need to be educated in domestic violence matters, and that's what we did. Now, to conclude, I wanted to just give you an unsolicited letter that one of the jurors in this case gave us. And basically they said that the victim's experience was believable. They didn't expect her to remember everything. Her story was inconsistent. She didn't even know the color of the cleaner. But instead of making us think she was a liar, it convinced us that she was human and was traumatized. Her testimony had not been well crafted. She had not been coached. Her previous testimony was never actually inconsistent. Details were added over time. That was totally consistent with our experience of retelling stressful events. They also said the expert witnesses were very helpful in understanding the issues, as well as a welcome relief from the drilling of the other witnesses. Their testimony was enlightening and much less stressful. The witnesses regarding the other assaults were compelling. The witnesses were far from perfect individuals. Even though their moral standards are in stark contrast to mine, I had compassion for them. Their imperfect life choices convinced me that Anthony Murphy deliberately picked victims that would not be believed nor fight back. And then they had kind things to say about the prosecution, and we appreciate that. They said not only were the evidence and visuals convincing, but their handling of the case was amazing. Like a good mystery, we were clued into what was coming. Poor police investigation, lack of DNA, violence in marriage, lack of consistent testimony. Thus, we weren't shocked when the details were presented. We knew what was coming. I think that was key in our acceptance of what happened. So I would encourage prosecutors during jury selection and in an opening statement to address areas that are going to need to be explained to a jury, areas where people might jump to conclusions. So we found that to be effective. Here's my contact information. If you ever have questions about this presentation or about presenting uncharged misconduct evidence to a jury where you have a serial offender, I do have some motion work that could be helpful, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. So that is my contact information. My phone number is 435-755-1865. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation and that it's been helpful to you. Thank you very much.